What is up, barbarians? It is Emmett, your nuclear barbarian, here with another weekly installment of the podcast. I hope you're doing well. Today's an exciting one. I have a new guest and a good friend, Dr. Chris Keefer, over at the Decouple podcast. What is up, Chris?
Oh, Emmett, lots. We're going to get into it, I'm sure, but it's a lot of fun being invited on your show. I've listened to the first, God, we had 3 episodes now?
Yeah,
Ferris,
at the time of recording this, yeah.
Isaac, Orr, and Bryce. Yeah, man. I'm loving your content, and I'm just really excited about this ecosystem that's forming. And I'm learning a lot from your podcast already. It's only been 3 episodes in, like I said, but yeah, it's a journey, man. I'm looking forward to seeing where this all goes.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, listeners who don't know, I've been on Chris's podcast, I think 2 or 3 times now. I think it's 3.
3.
Yeah, the trifecta. I'm a big fan, and so that's why I wanted to have him on, because he's been doing some interesting stuff over there and in Canada in the nuclear scene. So before we get into that, Chris, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you even ended up in this space, because I feel like you and I both came from relatively far afield from the nuclear space and have now become champions. So oftentimes that can be a pretty strange and compelling story. So how did this happen? How did you get here, man?
Yeah, I mean, if my 29-year-old self, let's go back a decade, could sort of see what my 39-year-old self is doing right now, they would shake their head. They might be appalled. They might want to come slap me in the face, right? I'm definitely a creature of the light. It's funny, I was just giving a talk, kind of a keynote at a labor conference that we'll get into soon. But I was trying to kind of establish and tell this story in a way that was hopefully compelling to that audience. But, some of the things I've been involved with, I guess more recently in that last decade, I co-founded a migrant worker health for seasonal agricultural workers being exploited up here in Canada, almost in sort of indentured servitude type environment, although they're not even allowed to stay in Canada, even if they wanted to. So I guess it's a bit different than that sort of typical European indentured servitude model where you could kind of earn your citizenship eventually. So yeah, started a medical clinic for those folks. I've been a staff physician at the Canadian Center for Victims of Torture. So that's been very, very interesting, basically working on medical reports, documenting injuries sustained under torture and supporting refugee applicants through that process here. And most recently, I've been at the forefront in solidarity with nurses in my local province and really across Canada more broadly, who have been the victims of 10 years of wage suppression and who are leaving their profession in droves, and really threatens that phenomenon, threatens really the future of healthcare here in my country. So those are like a few sort of windows into sort of my life in advocacy or activism or whatever you want. And so, yeah, how the hell did that lead into nuclear? And I guess it has to do with, and I've talked about this a few times on my podcast, but in emergency medicine, the sort of core philosophy is triage. So it's identifying the most serious situation, the most serious illness in the department, who's the sickest. And it's about mobilizing resources in an intelligent way, in a utilitarian way, to sort of save the most lives with, by mobilizing the meager resources you may have available. You could think about the scenario of a mass shooting, for instance. That becomes very important. And so I'm always asking myself, when I think about the world, what are the most fundamental and important issues, and how can I use my skill set to contribute to those issues? And so 3 or 4 years ago, around the time of the birth of my son, I was thinking a lot about climate change. Was probably the preeminent motivation. And yeah, that led me to sort of deep dive the topic, to become a doomer for some time, a catastrophist.
How long did the catastrophist spell last?
Oh shit. It was a couple of years. I was not fun at parties, man. I was just constantly,
But
quoting
the permafrost.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like, don't get me wrong. Like, it's still stuff that is very pertinent and concerns me. I'm not trying to belittle it. And it still motivates me to a huge degree. I mean, there's other concerns that I've learned about through the research I've done and the podcast I've done that are also kind of added onto that. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the key questions of our time, climate is huge. And by extension, energy is huge. And so understanding the energy system, getting a good solid grounding in that, analysis in that, seemed really pertinent and essential. And it was probably Mark Linus, who was a very compelling figure to me, someone who was an anti-GMO campaigner, big in Greenpeace in the UK, who wrote a book on climate and was celebrated for it. But then the scientists who he'd sort of the new friends or the new sort of tribe he'd met said, hey man, you really have to reevaluate your opinions on genetic engineering, because you're always talking about the scientific consensus, but you're completely ignoring it on that topic. And that led him in a, real soul searching, and that led him into nuclear energy as well. So he was an inspiring figure, because for those of us on the left or with roots in the left or who are post left or whatever we want to call it, that's a big question to wrestle with. Nuclear energy can get you booted from the tribe. And I mean, I'm so glad to have been booted from those tribes, in retrospect, but it really is. Yeah. And then this kind of new community that I've met through the podcast and through the activism is it's amazing. I get to speak to some really incredibly creative and intelligent thinkers. So it's been a real blessing.
Yeah. So Mark Linus is sort of this gateway for you. And then what starts to happen after you find him, start to become persuaded on this? Like, walk me through what it was like for you to change your mind and to not be a part of that tribe anymore. Because I think we don't hear about that part of it a lot, but that's an important part of the journey. And I think something we have to pay attention to if we want to convince people and change their minds.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so my ex-wife, became very tired of my doomerism and said, fucking shut up and do something about it. And what she had in mind, being slightly crunchy granola, was, fucking sort the compost better and take out the recycling, right? And buy organic food. And yeah, I kind of went in a different direction there, more in an eco-modernist direction. But yeah, I mean, in terms of changing my mind, I think like I was talking with a friend, Myrto Tripathi, and she was saying, listen, like activism in like the 90s and early 2000s, it was all about human rights, right? It was very centered in humanism. And contemporary youth activism is very centered in kind of an anti-human narrative. And so I was never a anti-nuclear activist. I certainly was probably anti-nuclear in terms of my core beliefs. And that's centered in questions really of being kind of anti-technology, that we needed a big sort of culture shock or political change, not, the solutions were not technological. I remember, ironically, Ontario, where I'm from, is 61% nuclear powered. We have 3 huge generating stations that do that. One of them is very close to where I live in Toronto. And driving on the highway past the city of Pickering, where the plant is located, I used to step on the pedal a little harder or hold my breath, which is just completely hilarious. Like,
that's amazing. I love that. That's so good.
As I've learned more about particulate air pollution, and it's just, our clean air is due to the fact that our nuclear plants provided the energy to phase out coal. Restarting several reactors did that for us. So it's a huge kind of irony.
So you were sort of more into the, like, as the guys over at Space Commune like to joke, return to monkey.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a very strange life. In my teens, I was a neo-Luddite. I was a self-described neo-Luddite. I come from, my mom's side of the family came over from Ukraine. They left 1937, like hella good timing. And, we're peasants, right? And then worked their asses off. And because of the opportunities available here, became professionals by the time my generation came along. So like I come from a comfortable background, right? And I think, as you sort of talked about, environmentalism is very much this kind of elite concern. I was sort of, convinced that social hierarchy was the problem, and that technology is what enabled that. And, romanticized this idea of kind of hunter-gatherer society, pre-modern society. Like, that's kind of what we needed to go back to. And I took that to an extreme, man. Like, I became a
full
real
paleo.
Well, not like paleo diet, but I became a survivalist, right? And I grew up in the country, so there was a lot of woods around available to me, and I learned how to, trap and how to, identify wild foods, how to make shelters. I can literally make fire with sticks. It's called bow drill fire. And I was like,
that's awesome.
This comes from a day and a time when we, technology was so common that everybody could do this, right? Like, that's incredible. I ended up, because my family wasn't a hunting family and I wanted to learn about that as part of my sort of neo-Luddite journey, I, hopped on a Greyhound bus, traveled for 72 hours straight. I'm 6'9", right? I was crumpled into this tiny bus, and I ended up, like, I thought I was going to find, like, I guess my Carlos Castaneda figure, or, live that life and find some native person that would like teach me how to hunt and trap and become one with the land. I ended up getting hired by a big game outfitter, which was pretty bizarre, but that's how I learned how to hunt. And I actually ended up being taught how to moose hunt in particular by my good friend Jerry Bike, a guy from the Nacho Nation up there, but under like really different circumstances and less romantic circumstances than I had anticipated. But nonetheless, I mean, that gives you a bit of a sense of the one extreme that I've lived. And then, through going to medical school and working in hospitals, right? These, you've called nuclear plants industrial cathedrals. I mean, hospitals are these like cathedrals of social solidarity, especially in Canada, where it's a publicly funded system, and you can have, it's just incredible, that kind of a quality of care that is the result of that. And anyway, I mean, a hospital is this large, complex institution, lots and lots of people working together, a very risky environment, sick people, tons of opportunities for error to occur. I think that's kind of what made me much more comfortable with nuclear and large, complex, centralized things, was like just seeing the inherent benefit of these institutions and starting to get a much more positive take on what humans were capable of. And I mean, along the way as well, I after I finished school, I bought a small farm. Well, I took out a huge loan, which are available to doctor types, and set up a bit of an intentional community there on the border.
No way.
On the border of a native reservation, the largest native reservation in the country, because I mean, it's an area of interest to me, Aboriginal health. And also this was a huge agricultural area where they import a lot of Mexican and Jamaican migrant labor. And so there's a lot of sort of like justice issues to kind of work on in the area. But and I've sort of got into my sort of nuclear origin story, but I ended up kind of moving on from that back to the city, and kind of here we are, I guess. I'll stop there because I could run on for a while, and I don't want to be self-indulgent in this.
No. I mean, that's really fascinating, right? So, I mean, that is quite the shift in perspective as you move through that. And so by the time you're willing to be convinced by the benefits of nuclear, you become a podcaster.
Right.
Like, how did you conceive the idea for Decouple, and like, what did you want when you started, and what is it now? What have you learned? Just tell me about that journey now.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. So, I mean, I think a really important part of this was probably 2 or 3 years of pretty extensive reading. And, when you have a baby and you're out for long walks, pushing the stroller, trying to keep the little one asleep, you can hold a book, or you can hold your Kindle. And I mean, at least I could. So I ended up reading a lot, and I'm really glad for that phase, because there's this saying, no investigation, no right to speech, or to speak, I should say. And that's pretty draconian, but on the same sense, there's a lot. I mean, it's so easy to start a podcast these days. Decouple is in the top, it's rated in the top 5% of podcasts. But I mean, that's really a testament to just how fucking easy it is to start a podcast, crank out a few episodes and quit, right?
Well, that's, because most people don't get beyond the first like 3 months or 3 weeks if they're lucky. Yeah. And so if you can hang out there for like a year, then you're like in the top 5%.
Totally. Yeah. Anyway, so lots of kind of investigation thinking. And I mean, this encouragement to do something about it. That was really good advice. I went in a different direction, obviously. I did college radio back in university, and it always was astounding to me that I could read a book, be super inspired, and find a way. We didn't have Twitter back then. It was a little more complicated, but find a way to contact the author and have like a hour-long conversation and pick their brain. Part of my journey into medicine, I think, any kind of youth who's looking at a future career, like any career can look kind of shitty, especially when you look at how it's practiced in the status quo sort of performance. And, I was inspired by a physician in California who in the 80s was working a lot in a rural area with migrant workers, actually, and they were fleeing the civil wars, the US-backed civil wars in Guatemala and El Salvador, and he ended up becoming very compelled by those stories and went and worked. Essentially, he was a Quaker and a pacifist, but he went to work behind guerrilla lines in El Salvador. Crazy story. He's done that for a few years. Yeah. I mean, and so being able to call this guy and talk to him and be inspired and like that, those are the kind of things that led me into medicine. Not like, I want to drive a nice car and whatnot. So that echoed with me, and I'd always wanted to get back into radio journalism as a result. And I mean, it's the lockdowns happened. I recently divorced, and I had a bit of time on my hands as a result of, the social world just collapsing around me. And so I God, I'd been talking about it for a while. The first episode is a friend of mine who's an amazing filmmaker, Jesse Freeston. And, in terms of finally getting up the gumption to do it, we just had a Zoom call and he's like, tell me what you want to do. And it turned into a pretty exciting little thing. And, the rest is history. I've been really lucky getting guests. And yeah, I'm 94 episodes in now. And,
Wow.
I've learned so much. And early on people were like, yo, you're keeping up quite a pace there. You might want to slow down. You might run out of things to talk about. But this area is fascinating. And in some sense, I kind of feel like not an imposter, but who am I? But I get to be, I think, at the forefront of something really, really exciting that's going on in terms of, this whole historic moment we're in. We're living in this crazy energy crisis right now, and the benefits of having spent years researching that and talking with world experts is hugely informative. I'm heading to COP26 next week, this climate conference that's happening in the midst of this energy crisis, and the framing of that is so interesting. And I feel so blessed by the insights that my guests have given me to understand this historic moment. I guess like a key motivation for me is just like seeking out the truth, uncovering it, chasing it to its lair, to get a little bit poetic there. And the podcast is fundamentally a journey for that. And that's what kind of scratches the itch. I like fighting for the underdog. And I think what I'm fighting for is really important for people, for working people, for nature, for the whole gambit. So it does align with all of this kind of trajectory of my life. I'm suspicious of people that sort of switch allegiances on a dime. And so I understand why people might be like, what the fuck? You were like a neo-Luddite. Now you're like this techno-optimist. But, it took a lot of years, a lot of retrospection. I think there's also a huge benefit to being able to change your mind in the face of new evidence and new life experiences. So,
Yeah. To me, it's sort of like, I've had friends be like, how did you end up here? Talking
yeah,
about energy. It seems surprising or whatever. I remember somebody was just like, why does so-and-so person we mutually know, this person has nothing to do with energy space, the person who was talking to me, why does this person like talk about it when they don't have any credentials? And I was like, well, because like the people who do have credentials are all bought and paid for and lie all the time without
right,
consequences.
right,
So we need like non-experts to step in and speak on behalf of the truth and hold
right,
these people accountable. And I think what I've learned from watching Decouple go through is that there's huge appetite for clarity on these issues from sources off the beaten path.
right.
I'm sure for you, it's been transformative to get to hear all of these people. Like, what have you learned over the course of the podcast, or how has the podcast changed the way you've thought about these issues before you started it?
Well, first off, I think that's a really interesting question around like, what expertise, what right to speak do you have on these topics of energy? And I think that's where this kind of journalistic bent comes in. Journalists are almost always outsiders to the thing that they're covering or studying. And just your interview with Robert Bryce, what an expert he's transformed himself into over the years of, covering Enron and writing several books. I have ambitions to do that eventually, to write books. And your comment as well on expertise. I think we have to have a lot of respect for expertise. We need to be aware of outlier experts as well. I think that's really, really important. You'll see in the anti-genetic engineering, anti-vax, anti-nuclear worlds, there'll be some sort of celebrity experts that are, almost become figures of worship for these communities. And they're crazy outliers. It's wild. But also, within energy, there's, I was talking to a union rep in the International Brotherhood of Electric Workers, and, he had such a on the ground experience and set of insights on energy, on nuclear, on wind and solar, for instance, that's just like utterly lacking amongst this like academic energy groups. And it's a bit reminiscent of the way that the left has, become completely out of touch with the workplace, with workers, engineers, people who can have a blue collar analysis and a feel for how things work. I'm wandering a little off topic there, but I thought that was important to mention. Your question was what I've learned in the podcast, or?
Yeah, and if it's changed the way you've looked at certain things and how it's changed that.
Oh God, man. Yeah, 100%. It's been a journey. I think it's been interesting, like the kind of editorial choices, because fundamentally you decide kind of who you're going to have on, what positions you're going to take. And I think it's really important to sort of maintain that beginner's mind. And there's been moments in the podcast journey where I become, really, really certain of things, and then step back and been like, I'm a medical doctor who's gotten interested in this in the last, year, maybe kind of hold your horses a little bit. So there's great kind of moments for that. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of answering, I'm probably not answering your question directly, but in regards to kind of choosing an editorial line, it's been very interesting for me doing the thing that's not easy, which is it's within climate concerned circles, or within, the pro-nuclear community, there's, I think, a huge temptation to I heard someone say this in a tweet recently, to like kiss the ring of renewables in order to advocate for nuclear.
Yeah, I believe that was our friend. Our friend is
still,
was it?
I mean, it may be several people who've had parallel thoughts on this, but yeah. And it's been an interesting editorial choice to explore that issue. To, some people are like, don't touch renewables, don't be critical, it's going to lose you friends. You can attract more. What is it again? You can attract more flies with
more bees with honey than with vinegar.
Than with vinegar, right? But in investigating that side and in delving into it, it's led me beyond just some questions of vital questions of intermittency and resource use, but also into these questions of labor and just transition, which I think are really essential. So that's been a thing. Like if I limited my editorial line and sort of done the safe thing, I would have robbed myself of a whole area of analysis. And I think a contribution that I've really been able to make in terms of, centering this idea on the grid as a commons, for instance, and other issues of labor, which I think we'll get into a little later.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like the idea, or I like the part of it that, limiting your editorial line to the safe way, and especially the safe way to get money, is to be very like kid gloves on for renewables, right? Very few people have the willingness to do that, because it does really get you forced out. You have to either already be an outsider or somebody who's willing to become an outsider to take that position if you're in the climate space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I think what was funny to me is that like everybody was like, Macron is saying he's going to build like 6 SMRs. And then like Marine Le Pen of the National Front was like, that sucks. I want to do a national EPR build out. And if I'm elected, I will rip out every single wind turbine in France.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, she gets to say that because she's outside of the beaten path for a lot of that discourse. But I think to me, it feels like an emperor has no clothes moment.
Well, it's absolutely essential. I mean, there's such a hegemony in the discourse. It's been one of the most brilliant marketing campaigns of all time. Edward Bernays would be impressed, shall we say, at the ways in which this kind of seamless, marketing strategy has occurred, with not just the companies themselves, but with the large environmental organizations really transforming themselves into salespeople for renewables. I mean, you look at the goals of Greenpeace, Sierra Club, NRDC, and goal number 1 or number 2, either explicitly or implicitly, is to, build fuck tons of renewables. And
that's what decarbonization means to them.
Right. And it's just so bizarre because, I mean, it used to be about, the old school Sierra Club stuff. Well, it was problematic to degrees, but it was like conserve, these beautiful areas of wilderness for posterity. Or, it was Greenpeace saving the whales. And I mean, they want to save the whales, and now they want to plug, 30,000 offshore wind turbines along the migration path of the endangered right whale down the east coast of the Atlantic.
And they didn't even save the whales. It's just that it became like economically untenable to pursue the whale thing like we were, and they happened to show up right when the party was ending, so they got to plant their flag in it.
Basically, yeah. And it's not like this kind of all of the aboveism or why not bothism. Again, that sort of comes back to my ideas around triage, where I do think there is an urgency around climate, and I am alarmed. And 2 to 3 degree increase by 2100 has major implications, and it's so multifactorial, right? Like you can be dismissive of like a single outcome, but when it's a lot of simultaneous factors coming together at once, that creates a lot of stress. And the way that I sort of communicate that climate concern is is with a metaphor of, a boat that's, trying to sail into a brighter future. And, with every climate impact, it's kind of like throwing an anchor over the back of the ship. And there's a lot of drag that starts to occur. And that can really, I think, impact human progress in dangerous ways. And so, I mean, that's kind of why I maintain a level of concern and urgency, but that's precisely why I'm so opposed to renewables. I mean, nuclear is often said as, oh, this is a false solution. I mean, renewables are absolutely a false solution to this problem on a whole number of arrays. But I mean, as we're seeing with this energy crisis right now, where we've had this wind drought, people don't think about when people think extreme weather, they think about hurricanes and other catastrophes. But I mean, this wind drought is an unusual climate event, and it's knocked back wind production in the EU by something like 20%, and that's had major implications. And Roger Pilkey's iron law of climate, or Robert Bryce's iron law of electricity. I mean, people will do whatever it takes to keep the lights on and to keep their kids warm. Mm-hmm. And it's just shown what a farce this renewables experiment is, because, we're not going to put ourselves at the mercy of the weather gods.
I mean, axiomatically, it just doesn't make sense, because the thing that they say, and I think you'd agree with, is that if climate change continues to gain ahead of steam, we're going to see more extreme weather events. Mm-hmm. Right. And then they're like, so we should make our electricity system dependent on increasingly extreme weather. Yeah. And it's like, that why would you do that?
Yeah.
If you believe A, why would you go to B? Right. Yeah. Like that, those don't really follow.
No, and I mean, and so much of, like, there's no longer any illusions that adaptation is an absolute key goal, right? At the environmental left has been, oh, no, it's all mitigation. It's all reducing carbon emissions. Like, adaptation is just an excuse to put more carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, at this point, we're locked into 2 or 3 degrees. Like, anyone realistic will tell you that there's no net zero in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Energy transitions are slow, even when they're thermodynamically viable. When you're moving to, more dense energy sources, more compact, more usable energy sources, it takes a long time. I think it was Bryce that I was just looking. No, it was Václav Smil I was looking at recently. Like, something like 100 years to move to 50% coal from biomass in the EU, or sorry, in Britain, and similar amounts of time, maybe 70 years to get to sort of 50% of use from petroleum. And I mean, gas has taken a long time for reasons that Mark Nelson could explain better, but energy transitions take a long ass time. We're locked in to, despite what the modelers say, we're locked in, I think, to a significant amount of climate change, and adaptation is an imperative, and reliable electricity is the kind of lifeblood of civilization, of the life support structures of modern civilizations, such as healthcare. I mean, it's important. The power lines to my hospital got hit by a road crew doing some excavation. Oof. And we were on diesel backup, and that was hairy, man. I mean, that generator fails, or the diesel fuel isn't delivered on time. We were shutting down areas of the hospital, turning off power to certain spots that were not as important. This was hairy, right? But I mean, beyond that, sewage treatment, water. I mean, just the water in your taps it's electric motors that power that, right? It's a Malthusian disaster if the grid goes down. Like, and we're used to these. I'm not sure if it was Meredith Angwin who said this, but like, the blackouts we're talking about, like Texas, or the blackouts of the future, which are generation blackouts, like lack of generation, the wind fucks off, or the sun doesn't shine, or both don't happen for a week at a time. These are not your grandmother's blackouts where a tree falls on a line and the linemen come out and get power back.
It's totally different.
Neighborhood.
It's totally different. I mean, that's, like, that's a black starting the grid problem. Yeah.
And people die, right? People die. Carbon monoxide poisoning was rife in Texas. People just
because they'll do whatever they can to stay warm and to keep the lights on.
And I mean, how much was it? I don't want to misquote this, but it was either $20 or $200 billion of economic damage.
Oh, tons,
in Texas, right? I mean, and you think about what could be done with $200 billion. And with nuclear, you get to have your cake and eat it too. You get, reliable electricity, you get all that implies, and you're decoupled from the carbon issue and from air pollution. It's an incredibly elegant solution, but people will do anything to avoid a nuclear future, including, this Rube Goldberg machine of intermittent energy sources balanced with batteries and transmission and just these fantastical ideas that are completely not scalable to avoid that. And it's puzzling. And I think we're starting to shift that by our enthusiasm, which again, people may find as being very, very strange, but I think we're onto something. And I think there's a cultural shift that's beginning. And there's nothing like an energy crisis to bring back nuclear.
I was about to say energy politics is coming back into the fold, whether people like it or not. I've so subscribers who read the newsletter know that I've been calling this winter, what we're coming into, the Black Cascade, because we will see the energy issues cascade over into the supply chain issues, and then vice versa. Right. And so that's going to lead to some seriously gnarly problems, from everything to agriculture, to retail, to, keeping the digital world we've built alive and stuff like that.
Energy is the secret ingredient in everything.
As Isaac says. Yeah, so
for sure. And just a couple things there. I mean, the consequences of this energy crisis will be felt differently throughout the world. I mean, Germany's a rich country. They'll get their fuel. They'll find
India
stuff to burn.
Or Lebanon?
India, exactly. It's shocking and it's disgusting and it's brutal. And another key point, I think, is, when energy is cheap, when fossil fuels are flowing easily, when there's a glut of natural gas, that's when renewables do very well, when they're rewarded. All of a sudden we're in an energy crisis. Fossil fuels are scarce, expensive. People start talking about nuclear again. And fundamentally, like, a nuclear renaissance is not going to happen because you and me are great advocates and we, convince some erstwhile environmentalists to drop their objections. It's going to happen for very pragmatic reasons. And we're seeing a pragmatic reason right now.
I think listeners should understand that there are billions of dollars propping up a green economy that is eroding our infrastructural security.
100%.
And that's going to be a really gnarly, really weird political fight.
An infrastructure that is vital, again, for climate adaptation.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's not just that the roads are getting incrementally shittier. It's that people are dying in their homes of monoxide poisoning in the Midwest because XL doesn't have enough coal to get us through the winter, and the renewables aren't delivering at the moment we need all the energy we can get. So that's what it looks like. And there are obviously a lot of labor concerns with that. So I wanted to talk to you about some of what you're doing with nuclear and labor in Canada, because I find it really exciting. And I know that you just gave a rousing speech recently. So I was wondering if you could tell us that story and talk about what you're doing.
Sure. I mean, so I've spent the 2 years, I founded an organization called Canadians for Nuclear Energy, really as an attempt to balance the spectrum, or become like a lot of our tactics and strategy are carbon lifted from what the Sierra Club is doing or Greenpeace is doing, but obviously with really different messaging. So we've used and employed a lot of similar tactics and strategies. I think, in this activity, it's really important to identify like a block or a base, right? I mean, in electoral politics, you talk about sort of getting an electoral block together. Nuclear doesn't have a lot of friends, but a natural place to start looking for those friends, particularly in Canada, is labor. So 76,000 people working in this sector, and they're almost all unionized. And they're the black sheep of the larger labor movement, because the labor movement has really been infected by the green left. I was at it was a conference put on by the Ontario Federation of Labor, which is an umbrella for really all the unions. And it was, the speakers were folks like Seth Klein, who I've actually had on the pod, who is a interesting guy, imagines a replay of World War II and our mobilization in order to build lots of wind turbines and solar panels, here in country, which, is not going to happen.
Andreas Malm has written something similar that is about war communism from the early Soviet days.
Rationing, baby. He loves rationing.
It's just baby shit. It's just baby shit. Yeah.
And to imagine that wouldn't require, like, what do you think fueled Canada's wartime production, which was impressive, right? Like we had the third or fourth largest air force in the world. Incredible, right? But what fueled that? A fuck ton of fossil fuels.
Oh yeah.
You think you're going to build all the wind turbines with wind turbines? No. It doesn't work that way. No free lunch there. Anyway, so that really drew me to thinking a lot about labor and the way in which, the environmental activists talk a lot about a just transition for fossil fuel workers, and they imagine they can kind of legislate, high wages and full-time work for intermittent energy and the intermittent jobs that are provided by wind and solar. I mean, you're putting up new solar panels every 20 or 30 years. You're commissioning and decommissioning wind turbines but there's no parking lot outside of a wind farm or a solar farm, right? There's a small parking lot, maybe 30 spaces outside of a large natural gas plant. Our nuclear plants in Ontario, these are 4 to 8 unit sites, thousands of parking spots. So that led me to really reach out to labor, to, in my tweets, to really link them, and a local campaign to save a nuclear plant. I've who are the natural allies in that? Well, fuck. I mean, the 3,000 people working at that nuclear plant who are about to have their jobs pulled out from underneath them, right? And not to mention the 4,600 full-time equivalent jobs that are spin-offs from that nuclear plant. And so in appealing to labor, I started to be noticed, call people, make relationships, get in on meetings. And that led to an invite to tour the world's largest operating nuclear facility, which is located right implausibly in Ontario, Canada. Bruce Power, which puts out about 6.4 gigawatts of electricity. It's
my God,
astounding. It's the world's largest. I mean, it's probably the world's largest generating site. Never mind nuclear. I mean, it's nuclear because you can do that because of energy density. And so I was invited by some of the nuclear unions to come and to give a talk and to tour this facility. And it was absolutely incredible. I mean, just going to this plant is in a more rural area. There's a couple small towns around it, where the nuclear workforce is from. And it's like time traveling, man. These are thriving, prosperous towns full of unionized workers who have great jobs and with a really active union movement. And there's a kind of, and I shouldn't say this has always been the case, but certainly at the present moment, there's a lot of like the relationship between management and workers is quite good because everybody's focused, for instance, on issues of occupational safety. I mean, if someone sprains their ankle at a nuclear plant, that's a nuclear accident, right? I mean, so there's periods in which there's millions of hours worked without any injuries on site. And I mean, that literally could be a back sprain, like anything that requires medical attention.
Right. The safety culture is intense.
And for workers, that's a really good thing. I mean, we can talk about that. There's some problems with that in terms of overregulation and whatnot. But for workers,
we don't need meltdown safe bike racks.
But I mean, just like being at this conference, going to the pancake lunch at the Carpenters Union Hall, and just the kind of genuine sort of like, I'm gonna introduce the next speaker. This is my sister, whoever, and not sort of having emerged from a labor background, or not like labor, just that culture not really existing. I'm like, oh, that's literally your sister, and like, no, like the sister and brotherhood of labor. That was a really incredible experience. And yeah, I mean, I think I was able to give a pretty rousing speech. I have those bona fides of having founded a migrant agricultural worker clinic, of my work, and I think I was able to sort of really onboard a lot of people that have been skeptical. I attended this Labor Confronts Climate conference, and just thinking that the kind of intellectuals that they're speaking and trying to rally the troops had messages which were profoundly anti-labor, that would result in thousands of people losing their jobs in shitty jobs of the future, essentially being a solar panel installer in communities, like these healthy communities that I was seeing there around the nuclear plant falling apart. And then touring the actual facility, I mean, they're in the midst of Canada's largest infrastructure project, which is the refurbishment of our CANDUs, which every 30 to 40 years needs some parts swapped in and out. And that's Canada's largest infrastructure project. There's days when there's 10,000 people going on and off site. It's wild. And then, going into the facility itself, there's 2 sides to it. So there's 8 reactors total, with 2 buildings with 4 reactors and 4 generators each. And I mean, the turbine hall is half a kilometer long.
Whoa.
Right. For coming off this site is extraordinary. And you realize that what's required, for our climate goals and our electrification goals is we need to build 2 more of these facilities, 2 more of the world's largest operating nuclear plants in the world. And, it's a little disheartening because, I think as I've investigated, as you've investigated on your podcast, exhaust why nothing feels possible anymore. Deregulation, I think is one of the big forces, but also, neoliberalism has really impacted our ability to do big infrastructure projects. And so in a sense, there was a bit of melancholy, like looking at this incredible accomplishment and thinking, can we do that again? Right. And we certainly can't with the kind of culture that we're being fed, in which, to be honest, the PMC or the kind of labor management folks are receiving from the folks that come and speak at their conferences. So I'm excited about hopefully being invited back and being able to offer a different perspective on, which shares a climate concern for sure, but which is thinking more broadly about what's beneficial to labor, and this, again, this way where you can have the cake and eat it too, and that includes high quality jobs and good things for the labor movement.
Right. I mean, to me, one of the things that is exciting is that they're so responsive, right? They're like, oh, yeah, like this is the message I want to hear. The thing that I'm curious about is like, do you get a sense of like how they feel about the environmental movement and its like staunch anti-nuclearism? Like, I think in America, the effect on nuclear workers has been profoundly demoralizing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Is that true in Canada as well?
Well, and it's probably led those union or those workers to be like, fuck the environmental movement, fuck like climate change, whatever, right? Like, just we're doing our job.
Or I think for them it's sort of just like, yeah, I don't care, man, whatever. If they're going to close down the plant, they close down the plant. The IBEW, because it's in with the Democratic Party, will get some of us a front row seat to being solar panel installers, And
or they'll go to the UAE. They'll go to the UAE and become reactor operators over
right,
there.
or they'll go, or there's always some deal with the decommissioning of like who will stay to decommission,
Right.
like who's going to do
Right.
that. And I'm not dunking on these people at all, because the labor movement in America has been really ground down over the last
Yeah.
few decades. It's been painful to see. And just putting myself in their shoes, it would suck if I knew that there were all these people who think they're saving the planet, think I'm like this like monster for keeping the cleanest, densest energy we have running.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. You do hear from nuclear labor this thing of, well, we're not here to bash renewables. We need everything.
But he's got to kiss the ring.
Got to kiss the ring, right? Got to play it safe. And especially in like, this was nuclear unions inviting the Canadian Labour Congress, like the rest of the labor movement, which again has typically not treated them very well at all, ignored their existence, not stood up for them. I mean, this Pickering nuclear station, which employs 3,000 people, there's not been a peep, as far as I can tell, from the labor movement or from the political class in general about losing this huge industrial facility.
No, the left didn't show up for the Indian Point workers. The New York DSA was basically not our issue, not our problem. Anyway, we've got a public power campaign that slates nuclear as a fossil fuel, so we're going to go ahead and do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a big focus of my work is to combat precisely what you're talking about, that demoralization. A lot of our campaigns hinge on slogans like, nuclear workers are clean air heroes or climate heroes, or, I mean, one of the really impressive things, not only that we have the largest operating nuclear facility in the world, but that facility churns out medical isotopes, which enable modern healthcare. Anything made out of plastic that you need in healthcare, be it an IV cannula, an endotracheal tube, all the shit, the PPE, that all needs to get sterilized, and you can't put it in an autoclave and expose it to high temperatures. It'll fucking melt, right? So how do we sterilize all that? How do we enable sterility in our medical treatments? Well, it's medical isotopes. And Bruce Power, this enormous power plant, provides cobalt-60, which is used to sterilize 40% of the world's single-use medical devices.
Amazing.
Right? Enough to sterilize 20 billion pieces of PPE, right? So yeah, these people working at these plants, not only, did they phase out coal, the greatest greenhouse gas reduction measure in North America, not only did they take smog days from 53 a year down to 0 a year by providing the power to eliminate coal, they enable modern healthcare. I mean, so these people are heroic. I mean, I'm called a hero for being a doctor on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. I mean, whatever, I can't do shit if the lights are not working.
Yeah.
Right. If I don't have electricity. And these people showed up, they were quite late in the line to get vaccines made available to them. I was advocating around that. So I think labor is a key area. Yes, they've been really bashed since the 70s and 80s, but I think they're a key ally, and there's a kind of symbiosis there between nuclear advocates and labor. So it's a huge focus of my work.
Yeah. That's amazing. So, I mean, I'm excited to see what falls out of that, right? Like, I hope that we can get more of that in America. I hope Diablo Canyon will especially be a flashpoint for that. I feel like a lot of unions are going to come together for that. And I think there will be a deeper appreciation for labor after the logistics and energy crisis of this winter flare up and then come to a close. But while all of this is unfolding, and while the Biden administration's insane climate plan has basically been strangled in its crib, thank God, they are all meeting at COP,
Yes.
which you will be at. So tell me about COP, what you hope to do there, what you think about it, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, obviously, I'll have a lot more to say once I return. For some of the nuclear advocates going, it's their third or fourth COP. I have, very little idea of what I'm stepping into, other than the fact that Leonardo DiCaprio is jetting out there, that they have a green zone, a blue zone, and what's being joked about, a platinum zone for kind of elite billionaires to come and express their concern. I mean, I think it's a total charade. I think even, I think there's almost a broad consensus, ranging from those environmental groups. I think we all know that not much is going to come out of this. I think it's just going to be very interesting human theater to be there and document. I have a past that gets me into the NGO media area, maybe some chances to harass a decision maker on the street for an interview.
It's fun getting into trouble.
Right. It's going to be fun. I mean, we're talking about doing a nightly newscast called the Daily Cop Out. We'll be producing some great media there and live streaming and releasing lots of episodes through the kind of Decouple media platform. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting time for climate. People are scrambling. Countries are scrambling across the world to secure fossil fuel investments. And I mean, this energy crisis is really the product of the climate movement. There's this inherent tension there. There's been a divestment in terms of investments in fossil fuels. At the same time, there's been a crushing of nuclear. And if you're crushing all forms of reliable energy, and then the wind dies off for half a year or full year, what are you left with? So this is really a great example of the climate movement shooting themselves in their feet. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether that percolates through. I'll see if I have a run-in with Greta. Yeah, I mean, I'll have a lot to say afterwards, and maybe I'll try and come back on to kind of share some reflections there. But certainly we'll be producing a lot of media, and hoping to shine a light on some of the contradictions at play.
Right. So, I mean, that's sort of what's interesting to me about COP. Like, I heard, and you can tell me if this is true or not, that the nuclear industry is basically not really allowed to participate in COP discussions.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, the renewables folks are welcome. The red carpet's been rolled out, but yeah, nuclear is the enfant terrible. Not welcome. I mean, there's a whole group of nuclear advocates that will have a presence in the NGO zone, and that's important. But yeah, I think officially from the sort of green zone, from the decision maker zone, not welcome. Yeah.
I mean, I just don't know. I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be very, very illuminating for the renewable space. I have a feeling that at some point in America, at least, and no doubt because it's America, this will redound throughout the world, that there's going to be some legislative rethinking about what exactly nonprofits are and what they do and how they engage with the political and policy space. Mm-hmm. And I think that will have pretty direct consequences on the hope for renewables, which is basically propped up with hedge funds, NGOs, and crooked politicians. Mm-hmm. That's all it is, right? It's just conference bullshit and corruption. I don't think that's going to last forever, especially if people are feeling incredibly threatened by these seemingly supra-political groups and they're struggling to keep their lights on.
Well, and the shell game's already falling down. I mean, I was reading a piece earlier today that polysilicon prices are up about 300%. Yep. And you know why? Because China's in a coal shortage right now, and they can only run their factories 2 days a week so that the whole grid doesn't black out.
Thank you for reading my newsletter, Chris.
Is that you?
Yeah.
Well, happy to spread the good word. I mean, what a wild story though, right? I mean, when fossil fuels are not available, the whole sort of house of cards starts to fall down. And, I'm looking forward to your future newsletters because I think you're really going to be at the forefront of bringing accountability to and exposing some very important things. I mean, just your last episode of Robert Bryce, I kind of clipped that, and this section where, you talked about Mark Z. Jacobson's slap lawsuit, like that needs to get out there. We need to be putting the pressure on Stanford and on the places that house these people and hold them to account. because they have a real outsized role that they do not merit by
Yeah.
any sense of it, like ethical standards.
No, absolutely. I mean, take a look at what Center for American Progress did to Roger Pielke, or tried to do to him,
Mm-hmm.
ended his career. We only found out about that, or tried to end his career. We only found out about that because of email dumps that came from WikiLeaks. That was
Wow.
their explicit purpose for doing that.
Wow.
Is because he was like, actually, your stuff about how climate increase creates natural disasters that destroy more than ever, he was just like, isn't like true in the way that you think it is. And
Right.
that's why he no longer works at 538. They got him blackballed from there
Right.
as a climate denier.
Right.
So that's what we're up against. So I think labor power and just everyday people realizing that they need and rightfully want reliability for these essential things like electricity and heating and air conditioning are really going to be our greatest asset going forward. And it's really exciting to see you making headway there in Canada, talking to people all over the world about this through Decouple, and then going to COP, which I'll definitely want to have you back on for a COP debrief, because I want to know all about what it's like to hang out with lizard people. Tell me how the salamanders are, Chris.
Oh boy. Oh boy. I look forward to it, Emmett. I look forward
Yeah.
to
So, everybody, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chris Keefer. You should check out his podcast, Decouple. Keep an eye on everything he does. And stay strong, stay sharp, and stay radiant. We'll see you next time.